everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, What Your HR Dashboard Isn't Telling You, Surprising Workforce Insights from Big Data Analytics, sponsored by Evolve, presented by Michael Hausman, and moderated by Julie Engel. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webcast has been approved for IHR certification credits, 1 HRCI webcast with certification credit, and 1 HRCI e-learning credit. You will receive an email within 1 to 2 business days of this webcast with the certification information. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast to receive your credits. Questions may be submitted anytime during the webcast by typing the question in the Ask a Question text field and clicking Submit, the orange button located on your screen. And I will now turn it over to Michael.
Great. Thanks very much. So we want to talk a little bit today about some of the predictive analytics and big data applications that are being applied to HR metrics. And so the high-level overview is what your HR dashboard isn't telling you. And so we're going to share some of the surprising workforce insights that we've been able to generate from those big data and predictive analytic models. So to start, we're going to just talk broadly about what is big data, how's it being used, and ultimately what's the definition, what are we even talking about. Second, we're going to drill in using a very large data set on a number of different hourly employers. We're going to try to understand what is it that drives workforce outcomes. Is it workforce relationships, job characteristics, worker characteristics? We actually divided into 5 different buckets, and we're able to use our data and our tools in order to understand, where are the low-hanging fruit. And then third, this is really the fun part. We're going to be sharing a lot of surprising insights from big data analytics. So trying to understand things like the impact of weather conditions on workforce performance and or the impact of toxic employees on attrition of coworkers. So again, we're going to start very broad, and then we're going to drill down, and towards the end, we're just going to share a lot of interesting insights that we've generated over the course of the past year. So to start, we want to answer just a fundamental question: what is big data? I'm sure everyone on this webinar has heard about it, and it's bantered around in the news, but oftentimes there's not a clear definition. And how we have chosen to define big data is in terms of what we call the 3 V's: volume, variety, and velocity. Now, just in terms of volume, what we found is that data sets are growing exponentially, and so the amount of data and information that's available to HR professionals is just much greater than has been ever in the past. In terms of variety, we're finding that these data are emerging from a variety of different sources. So previously it was just the HRMS systems, HR management systems. Now we're supplementing that with data from performance management systems, from learning management systems. And so we now need to find a way to ensure that these different data silos and warehouses are able to communicate with one another so that we can create a single data set with all of these different factors. And third, velocity. These data are not only larger and more expansive than ever before, but they're being generated more quickly than ever before. Previously, these databases were being updated perhaps monthly, weekly. Now we find that they're being updated on an hourly basis and sometimes in real time. And so with the emergence of these large data sets from a variety of different sources at speeds that are unprecedented, we need to ensure that we have the tools available in order to analyze them and generate insight. The big data revolution has really emerged from a variety of different industries, and only now are we seeing it being applied to the workforce. So everyone is probably familiar with the Moneyball example, Oakland A's, who were using advanced analytics to come up with new and interesting ways to value players and talent in baseball. What we found is that similar revolution occurred within financial services a couple decades ago with the emergence of credit scores. Credit card companies were able to get a much better sense of how reliable individuals were and how to assign risk to them. In healthcare, we've seen the emergence of evidence-based medicine. Previously, rates of, for example, cesarean section versus natural childbirth varied tremendously by hospital and by region. And so what we found is that using data and evidence-based to ensure that decision criteria are more consistent, we're ending up with more consistent decision-making and diagnoses. And finally, in the workforce, again, we're now beginning to see this crest of the wave where data is being used to drive decisions, not only at the point of hire, but beyond that point, in order to understand how do we train people, who to train them, how to supervise them and develop them, so on and so forth. So we want to make a point, and this is a little bit dramatic, but we believe that the HR dashboard is dead. It's valuable to get a sense of how your organization has done in the past, but none of these knobs or dials that you see in front of you are really actionable. They don't provide recommendations as to how you can change your workforce and what decisions you can make in order to optimize that workforce and get as much as you can out of your people. And so we want to move from a backward-looking approach towards the workforce to something that's predictive and much more forward-looking. So instead of looking at things like recruiting costs over time or the termination reason codes that people are given when they leave, we want to take a more proactive approach to hiring and management. So these are some of the questions that we're hoping to answer. How can we improve customer experience? What's the best way in order to keep people around longer? How can we maximize net promoter scores? How can I achieve my year-over-year goals and targets? So ultimately, that's what the rest of the presentation is about, is drilling in and figuring out the causal factors of attrition and performance, be it productivity, customer satisfaction, sales conversion, and then we're going to drill in and figure out what knobs and levers we can pull and dial in order to achieve better outcomes. So before we move on, and Kathy, we're going to activate one of these polls, but we just want to get a better sense of the audience. And so we want to ask the question, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to workforce performance? Is it attrition, customer satisfaction, process efficiency, sales conversion, or schedule adherence? So I'm going to leave it open for maybe a minute or so just to give everyone the chance to vote, and we'll get a sense of where are the pain points that the people on the call have with their workforce. Okay. Great. Well, it sounds like we have 2/3 of the audience has voted. And actually, the winner by a pretty large margin is process efficiency, followed closely by attrition. And this is great. Actually, the majority of the rest of the presentation will be focused on attrition, but there are some implications for process efficiency and becoming more and more efficient at handling transactions, especially around the workforce. So in terms of drilling in and understanding what are the drivers of attrition and performance, this is just an example, and we're going to do something very similar to this, but using a much larger network level data set. But what we're able to do with predictive analytics is drill in and say, what are the causes of my attrition? And I should be clear that none of the results we see today are based upon surveys or polls. I'm an economist, so I'm naturally skeptical of the responses people give to surveys. So instead of asking people, why did you leave? What we simply do is we drill in and we understand the location, the nature of the job they do, their line of business, manager, a variety of other characteristics. And by using some advanced econometric techniques, we can tell you which of those are the biggest drivers of attrition. And so in this case, we actually see that managers account for 47% of the variance in attrition. Managers are quite frankly the biggest driver of attrition. When we look at something like customer satisfaction, we see similar results, but it does vary depending on what measure of customer satisfaction we're looking at, whether it be overall experience, problem resolution, or strategic measures. Manager, again, accounts for something between 30 and 40% of the variance. But again, we see a variety of other factors like unemployment rates, line of business, position type, and location are accounting for a large share of the variance there as well. So what really underscores all of this is that we want to move away from gut instinct and intuition when it comes to managing the workforce. Instead of hiring people based on largely subjective criteria and then training them according to what's worked best in the past, managing and developing them just on the basis of what people's experience has been, we want to inject a data-driven, evidence-based process to all of those decisions in order to ensure that the way in which we're hiring is focused on the criteria that matters the most, that people are trained and managed in an evidence-based way, based on strong empirical evidence as to what works best, what keeps them around longest, and what allows them to perform best. And then same with employee exit. We want to analyze employee departure in order to inform future selection and development, so closing that loop. So with that in mind, I'll talk a second about methodology. What we've done is we've compiled data from all of our data warehouses. And so we have represented within this data set 13 countries, 18 different industries, over 100 million employee performance records. And again, this spans a wide array of different positions, titles, industries. And so we feel that it's a very representative sample of the population of hourly employees that are out there. And what we've done is apply, again, a variety of advanced econometric techniques to those data sets in order to generate insight with a very high level of precision. And so any of the results that I'm sharing today are very robust, and we've actually shared them with media outlets in the forms of white papers and so on and so forth. So again, applying those techniques to that data set I just mentioned, we first analyze customer satisfaction, and we divide the drivers amongst 5 buckets: workplace relationships, macroeconomic trends, company practices, job characteristics, and worker characteristics. And we ask the question, what is it that really matters with respect to customer satisfaction? And what we find is that there are essentially 3 factors that stand out. The first is workplace relationships, and for the most part, those consist of supervisor-employee relationships. We look at worker characteristics, that's tied with relationships. Those worker characteristics are essentially the raw talent that you bring in, their technical skills, knowledge, proficiency, and behavioral attributes. And then third, company practices, things like referral policies, policies around overtime and shift. Those are the other big drivers of customer satisfaction within this realm. So between those 3, we account for essentially 90% of the variance in customer satisfaction, with the rest being attributed to macroeconomic trends, so changes over time, and just the nature of the job itself, job characteristics. Now, with those results in mind, we're actually going to open up another poll, and we're going to ask people, what do you think influences attrition, not performance, but attrition the most? Workplace relationships, macroeconomic trends, company practices, job characteristics, and worker characteristics. And again, I'll leave the poll open for about 30 seconds so we can gather enough responses. Okay. Great. Excellent. So we have over 3/4 of the attendees that have voted, and the winner is workplace relationships. And so everyone can actually give themselves a pat on the back, because when we go back to the presentation and look at the results, we actually find that that is indeed the case, that workplace relationships account for 54% of the variance in attrition. To put it simply, they account for the same share as everything else combined. Following that are macroeconomic trends, so change in unemployment rates, local wage rates. Those actually do have a fairly strong impact on whether people leave or whether they stay in their roles. Company practices, as I mentioned, things around shift and overtime and referral policies. Luckily, those are within the control of virtually every company, and that accounts for 11% of that variance. Job characteristics, the nature of the job itself, how difficult it is, whether it's frontline or back office, anything like that, that's 11% of the variance. And what's a little surprising is that worker characteristics, essentially the raw talent that you bring in, that accounts for only 8% of attrition. But the good news is that aside from the macroeconomic trends, each and every one of these are knobs and levers that are within the control of large employers. And so these are all opportunities, particularly workplace relationships, which is where we see the lowest hanging fruit. Those are opportunities we have to improve our workforce and to keep them around longer. And so I'll point out that from this point on, we're going to be sharing some of the insights around each of these buckets, breaking them down one by one. And all of these results pertain to attrition. I may mention performance a little bit, but we're really going to ask the question, how can we keep people around longer? And we're going to systematically break each of these down and try to understand what are the drivers. So let's start first with workplace relationships. I mentioned before, this can be supervisor-employee relationships, but there's another element of this that we'll dig into in a second. So first and foremost, we make the point, we've seen this almost consistently across all of our clients, that managers influence employee tenure more than any other factor. And this may be no surprise to people on this phone. IO psychologists through surveys have known this for decades, that managers are the biggest driver of attrition, but it's only recently, within the past few years, that econometricians have been able to apply a different set of methods and arrive at the same conclusion, which is that your relationship with your manager is the single strongest driver of whether you stay or go than everything else combined. We found from our data that employees with the best managers are actually 5 to 6 times more likely to remain on the job than employees with managers who are struggling. Just a case study, a very quick and simple example, for a company with 25,000 employees and something like 1,000 managers, we can save $1.9 million just by taking the bottom quartile of managers and up-leveling them, not turning them into supermen, but just ensuring that they're not the Michael Scotts of the world. We're able to save almost $2 million. And again, in many cases, these are just a few hundred managers that need to be trained in the proper way to sort of manage. So naturally, the question that comes out of this is, well, what attributes are we looking for in a manager? And so we're actually going to go back to the polls, and we're going to ask a question. I want my managers to be innovative and creative. And so we'll open up the poll, and people can either agree or disagree, and we'll leave it open for just about 20 seconds or so. Okay, great. Well, I think we almost have 3/4 of the attendees, and it sounds like the group has overwhelmingly agreed with this statement. When we go back to the presentation, actually we see a slightly different picture, that it's not intuitive what makes someone a good manager. What we found is that the single strongest driver of someone's success in a managerial role is consistency. We found that employees essentially are looking for a rock, someone who's very consistent and can be counted on to be very dependable and reliable day to day. We've actually found that higher creativity and innovativeness scores yield lower performance as managers. So in essence, we're actually not looking for people who can kind of think outside the box when we're looking for managing frontline employees. Instead, we're looking for people who essentially can toe the company line, can enforce policies properly, and obviously act as an answer for any employee questions that may emerge along the way. Similarly, multitasking is actually not something we want to look for in a manager. You want someone who actually kind of sticks to a task and can complete it and not do 10 different things at once. Likewise, for the case in point on the left-hand side, adaptability. That's the other thing we typically want to see in a manager, someone who's able to adapt to changing business conditions, who isn't necessarily static in terms of their viewpoint, and can change as business conditions do change. So one other way of thinking about workplace relationships is not relationships with managers, but actually relationships with other coworkers and employees. Gallup typically finds that the single strongest predictor of employee engagement is the answer to one question, which is, I have a best friend at work. And what we've actually done is we've looked at a specific type of coworker, and unfortunately it's a little bit negative in that we looked at toxic employees. These are people who are termed for policy violations, sexual harassment, drug and alcohol abuse, falsification of documents, things like that, and fraud. And we found that 3 to 5% of all terminations are actually related to one of those causes. So this is a non-trivial number of individuals who are breaking the rules. And we found a few things. First off, these people pose serious risks for the organization, not only in terms of their behavior, but we found that any team that they exist on, every other team member's performance suffers, and the other team members have a much higher likelihood of leaving. Again, no huge surprise here, but we found that the magnitude of the effects are in the 10 to 20 times range, whereas in many of the other cases we'll be presenting, we're talking in terms of double-digit percentage increases. So we're talking about 1,000 to 2,000%. The effects are huge, quite frankly. So then the natural question is, well, how do we find these people before we invite them into the workplace? And the answer is that it's very difficult. These people are savvy when they're given online assessments that try to tap into constructs like whether they follow rules. They tend to claim to be rule followers. And that's actually not obviously the case given the results that we see. So instead, we can identify them through looking at assessment scores on different constructs, things like service orientation and attendance and dependability. We find that they tend not to be very customer-facing, or at least customer-focused, and they're not very reliable and dependable. And so when we identify these people at the point of application through, for example, the existence of an online assessment, we're able to ensure that they don't poison the work environment where they exist. So let's move on from workplace relationships, and we'll talk a little bit about macroeconomic trends. So as I mentioned, these are changes in the unemployment rate, in wage rates, in a variety of different factors outside the workplace that can have an impact on who stays inside the workplace. Unfortunately, many of these we don't have a lot of control over, but when we anticipate changes in macroeconomic conditions, then we can be predictive about what changes we make within the workplace in order to keep people. So unfortunately, the first slide starts with some bad news. The good news is that we're in the middle of an economic recovery, and unemployment rates have been dropping consistently year over year. Unfortunately, the bad news is that research has shown when the economy gets better, people tend to leave their jobs voluntarily more frequently. They feel like more options are available to them, and they don't feel like they're fenced in. And so what we're anticipating based on projections is that attrition may increase as much as 25% as the unemployment rate returns to historic norms. So for example, for a company with 50,000 employees, this uptick in attrition can represent $22 million in additional workforce costs. So this is something we all need to anticipate and be prepared for, because these are changes that are ultimately going to affect turnover within our organizations and, as a result, the bottom line. We found from our data that these changes, the relationship between unemployment rates and turnover, is nonlinear. So it's not as if for each additional percentage decrease in the unemployment rate, you can expect a 5% increase in turnover. What we found is that there are certain thresholds beyond which the turnover rates seem to jump or stay the same depending on what the unemployment rate looks like. And so this nonlinear relationship is really interesting, because we need to ensure that we analyze this at the state level, or even more granular than that, and that we're constantly measuring those unemployment rates to see what the likely impact is going to be on specific sites in any given location, metropolitan statistical area, or micropolitan statistical area. So this is less macroeconomics and just more kind of surrounding conditions. We've actually found that weather can have a very big impact on performance. So again, this is going to be no surprise to anyone that inclement weather tends to reduce schedule adherence and increase absenteeism. But what is interesting is when we look at other metrics of performance. For example, we've looked at customer satisfaction, and we found that customer satisfaction tends to be better in colder temperatures. Likewise, we've looked at such KPIs as sales conversion, and what we found is that sales conversion tends to be higher in warmer temperatures. So again, once you've established a site, there's not a whole lot that can be done here, but depending on whether your organization tends to be customer satisfaction or sales focused, should dictate whether you decide to establish a location in Bangor, Maine, or Tempe, Arizona. These are all things we can think about at the initial point when we're deciding on what location to choose for a given site. And then one more within this bucket, and again, we'll leave it to a poll, but the question is, what matters more when it comes to keeping workers on the job? Is it distance to work or proximity to area amenities? And again, we'll open up the poll and leave it open for a few seconds just to give everyone the opportunity to vote. Okay. Great. Again, almost 3/4 of attendees participating, and it looks like distance to work wins by a large margin. So what we found, if we go back to the deck, we found the good news is both matter. There's no question that they both matter, and they're statistically significant drivers of attrition. But what we've actually found is that proximity to local amenities is a stronger driver of attrition than distance to work. So there's a walkability score that's defined in the bottom left-hand corner, but essentially what it represents is it's a 0 to 100 score measuring the extent to which there are local amenities nearby, dry cleaners, grocery store, convenience store, restaurants, so on and so forth. What we found is that that score is a significantly stronger driver of attrition than, say, the length of someone's commute to work. And so again, when we're thinking about what location to use when we're identifying sites for a new office or branch, We actually want to be thinking about those walkability scores as much, if not more, than whether the office is in a convenient location that everyone can get to from the center of town. So ultimately, those amenities, whether people can go to lunch nearby and whether they can pick up their dry cleaning, are huge drivers of attrition and something to consider. So we'll move on to company practices. As I mentioned, these are practices around things like overtime and shift. And again, the good news is these, again, are things that are well within our control to change. So first and foremost, let's talk about referrals. We've actually done a lot of work on referrals with research partners of ours at Berkeley and University of Toronto. And what we found is that referral-sourced employees are up to 20% less likely to quit. The magnitude of those effects are huge, and the good news is that they're very robust. We've tested them in a variety of different ways, and they stand up to close scrutiny. And so what's interesting is that when you consider the cost of the average referral, and it can range for an hourly employee, it can be as much as $40 to $150. But what that referral saves in terms of avoided turnover is something closer to $300 to $320. So the cost of that referral is actually well offset by the benefit of the referral in the range of 2 to 7.5 times. So the takeaway here is if you don't have a referral policy in place, you should really consider putting one in place. And if you do have one in place, you may want to consider increasing the benefits. Again, referrals are a great way to bring in good talent. What we found is that there are two effects that explain why people stay longer when they're referred. One is there's a selection effect. They can ask their friend, what's the job like? And they get a more realistic preview of what the job will entail. But there is what we call a treatment effect, which is you work at the job site with friends of yours and they can coach you. And they can provide insight and intuition into some of the challenges that you face when you're first ramping up. And so they can get you up that learning curve that much more quickly. So again, in general, referrals are a very good policy and something to consider using. Okay, another poll question. So we're going to ask first about overtime, and we're going to make the statement, more overtime tends to burn employees out and makes them more likely to quit. So agree or disagree? Okay. Great, so this is a pretty even split. In terms of the results, we see that 47% agree, 53% disagree. So when we go back to the deck, what we find is that, to be honest, this is a little bit of a trick question because there's a U-shaped relationship. We found that there's a middle ground here, that one, at least in the case of one client that we had analyzed, 1 to 5 hours of overtime was the sweet spot. Providing any more or less than that would either not engage employees or, on the other hand, might burn them out. So we found that employees that worked less than 1 hour overtime or essentially no overtime at all, they didn't have the opportunities to make a little bit of extra cash and they weren't as engaged. And so we found that those are represented by the purple line. They tended to leave more quickly. The light blue line represents that, 1 to 3 hours of overtime. Those are people who stayed longer because they were able to work some overtime. But 3 or more hours ultimately drove down survival rates. People left very quickly. And so the conclusion here is that you do want to allow for overtime, but oftentimes you want to cap it to ensure that people aren't working too much and they aren't getting burnt out as a result of all the overtime they may be working. So let's turn our attention to job characteristics, and let's just talk a little bit about the nature of the job, where it's performed, things like that. So first and foremost, a question we often get is how do wages matter, and how much should I think about increasing wages? And the insight that we generate here is encouraging because we find that wages do matter, not surprising, but not as much as people think. For example, a 100% increase in salary, so this is literally doubling someone's salary, is only associated with a 52% reduction in quitting. So it's not a 1-for-1 offset, it's actually a 1-for-1/2 offset. And we found that the effects are smaller in magnitude than a number of other factors. And quite frankly, raising wages is one of the most expensive ways to keep people on the job. So this isn't to say that you shouldn't provide wage increases and raises, but that there are a number of other more cost-effective ways to make people more engaged and to make them happier. Likewise, when we're talking about the timing of raises and promotions, we found that over and above the impact of having higher wages, there's what's called a halo effect associated with a raise, but that halo effect is somewhat short-lived. So at the end of the day, we know that it lasts at least a week, that quitting behavior drops a week after that raise, but we know that it doesn't last as long as a month. So bottom line is that after someone receives a raise, it's only about a month down the line when they're kind of back to their initial level of kind of utility. And so that's why we discourage raising wages across the board as a way to keep people make people happier. As I mentioned before, we found things like workplace relationships and a number of other factors are much stronger drivers of engagement and ultimately of attrition and workplace performance. So there's been a lot of controversy in the news around work-at-home employees. This started probably about a year and a half ago with Marissa Mayer. She made the decision that all Yahoo employees would have to work from the office and that no one could work remotely anymore. And so as a result of that, we actually conducted a study in which we dug into a number of different positions that could be work from home. And we asked the question, how do work from home employees compare to the attrition and performance of their non-work from home counterparts from people who are in the office? And what we found is not entirely surprising, but we found that work-at-home employees actually stay 28% longer than their colleagues that are working from the office in cubicles. And so this does give some credence to the notion that work from home is not a bad policy. Now, I should point out, if we look at performance, there are slight performance differences. So they start off performing essentially on par with one another. And then at about 120 days, we actually see that the work from home employees' performance starts to dip, whereas the non-work from home employees, those that are in the office, they continue to improve. So this is one of those trade-offs where, as you're thinking about engaging in work at home policies, you need to consider, is it attrition that we're trying to maximize? Is it attrition that we're trying to improve? Or is it performance that we're trying to improve? Because ultimately, the goal there is going to dictate very different approaches towards work at home employees. And finally, we want to dig into worker characteristics. And again, we're going to unpack this, but we're thinking now about who we bring in and their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and behavioral and psychometric characteristics. What's the nature of the raw talent that we bring into this workplace in order to get the most out of our employees? So this first insight is actually something we've shared on a number of different occasions, and it's really interesting in my opinion. We found, first off, when recruiters go through resumes, they spend an average of 7 seconds per resume. And what they have admitted they look for is unusual work history and previous experience. We've dug into our data and we looked at those two things, previous work history and experience, and we found that neither is a very strong predictor of tenure in these roles. So the notion that recruiters are looking for job hoppers or long-term unemployed as people to weed out and screen out of the recruiting process is actually bad practice, because ultimately those people stay on the job just as long and perform no worse than people with a more traditional work history. And we've actually released some of this insight more recently to Bloomberg around Barack Obama's statement in the State of the Union about how employers should consider long-term unemployed. We were really excited that we were able to support that with empirical evidence to show, using thousands of employees, that those employees, regardless of if they'd been unemployed for a number of years or whether they'd had a recent job, their performance was essentially the same. And so this supports the practice of considering things other than those resumes and looking a little bit deeper to understand the nature of someone's actual skills, the knowledge they bring to the job, their abilities to complete the position, and so on and so forth. So likewise, as I mentioned, we've talked about job hoppers, but job hoppers, just like the long-term unemployed, they can make great hires. And looking at people in the last 5 years, how many jobs they've had, there were individuals that selected they had 6 or more jobs that might be viewed as job hoppers in the parlance of recruiters. We found that their tenure on the job was no shorter than people that had fewer jobs in the last 5 years. And so data suggests that there are 2 to 5% of all applicants are weeded out simply because of this unusual work history and experience our data suggests that those are 2 to 5% of people that should be concluded. And again, if I could tell you that you can increase your sourcing funnel 2 to 5% without doing anything differently, I guarantee everyone on the call would take me up on the offer. And so this is one of those things to consider when you're weeding through applicants and trying to make the very best choices. Okay, so we want to talk about technical abilities. Moving beyond that resume, we're going to open up a poll, and we're going to ask the question, an employee's technical abilities are important to all job roles, to some job roles, or they're not important at all. So Kathy, if we want to just open up the poll, and we'll give people a couple seconds to respond to this, and then we'll give everyone the answer.
Hi, that poll was not created, so if everyone could just put their responses in the questions feature.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so I think we probably have an even split between all and some job roles. And what our data has shown is that tech savviness actually matters regardless of the role, that someone's proficiency with a computer is a strong predictor of their attrition and their performance regardless of whether their position involves using a computer or not. So quite frankly, we found that employees with high tech proficiency perform better and miss 15% fewer days at work, that they stay significantly longer on the roles, and they perform better on a variety of different KPIs. So here's an interesting, we measure this through the use of various questions about technical proficiency and also through typing scores and things like that. But here's one that's really interesting and insightful that we had generated a little while back is browser usage is actually a strong predictor of performance. So we found that users of Chrome and Firefox stay significantly longer and perform better. And when we dug into that, what we found is that it's not because those browsers necessarily produce better performance, it's because of what it shows when someone has taken the time to install a custom browser that isn't the default with their computer. They're shown that they're a little bit more tech savvy, that they weigh out their options, and that they're concerned with identifying the right tool that's going to make them as productive as possible. So that doesn't necessarily mean that employers should go to all of their computers and immediately demand that their employees should install Chrome or Firefox. What it means is that we can tell from people's technological footprint what sort of employee they're going to be, and then we can start to identify those questions that we want to ask in order to screen the right people. Let's talk about social media. So again, this is another thing that's been discussed in the media and discussed in the news, and there are questions as to whether Facebooking or using Twitter at work is a good or a bad policy. Well, independent of whether it's good at work, we just wanted to understand what does someone look like vis-a-vis their social media footprint. And again, we asked people, how many social networks do you use on a consistent basis? And as with the overtime study, we found a U-shaped relationship. Essentially, we found that 1 to 4 social media networks was a good thing, that people who were somewhat engaged online and had, say, a LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook account, those people stayed longer and performed better in their roles. And I should point out that most of these roles are technology-enabled and customer-facing. So it's not surprising that being a user of social media is something that promotes proficiency within these roles. But as I mentioned with the overtime results, that there's a sweet spot here. So fewer than 1 networks, essentially anyone who's not online or at least not using social media, actually tends to stay a shorter period of time. Likewise, those that are using 5 or more networks, they tend to stay not as long as people with a more traditional footprint. So the idea is, as we're considering someone's technology, that more isn't necessarily better, and there's a sweet spot here, but we should absolutely consider their usage of social media when we're considering their appropriateness for the job. So honesty. We've talked a little bit about this when we discussed the toxic employee results, but we found that honesty is actually a predictor of tenure and performance in these roles. Now, I should be specific. Measuring honesty is not a very easy thing. early on, when we deployed assessments and we wanted to get at this notion of honesty and integrity, we took a very naive approach to this. And what we did was we would ask people to choose between competing statements, something like, I like to follow the rules, or I like to meet new people and do new things. What's not surprising, perhaps, is that people saw through the question, they understood what we were trying to get at, and most people tended to endorse the honesty, the rule-following option. In fact, we found people that were more likely to endorse that response option were much more likely to be terminated for reasons that we would consider to be dishonest, for example, fraud and abuse and things like that. So we retooled the assessment, and what we decided to do to measure honesty was something a lot more interesting, which is we asked people up front, what's your computer proficiency? How good are you with a keyboard and mouse? What's your typing proficiency? And then a few screens later, once they couldn't go back, we actually tested them. We asked them, what's the shortcut for cutting and pasting text in a word processor? What's the name of the address that's uniquely given to every computer on the internet? And when we compared their self-reported computer proficiency to their actual computer proficiency, we found that a very interesting picture emerged. There were two groups of people that came out. One group were people who were relatively reasonable and honest about their computer abilities, and another group were people who essentially exaggerated greatly how good they were with computer. They claimed to be a software engineer in their spare time, but were hardly able to type 5 words a minute. And so by comparing those results, we got a much better and more robust picture of who is indeed honest and who is not. And when we then used those groupings to relate them to attrition and performance in the workplace, what we found is that those people who were in fact honest absolutely performed better and they stayed longer. And so again, the point of this is to say, A, honesty matters, which isn't surprising, but B, we need to be very cautious and careful about how we measure something like honesty in order to get a true read of that signal. Great. So with that, I wanted to leave some time at the end for Q&A, and I believe that Julie is going to be identifying a few questions that came up during the presentation and asking them, and I'm more than happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Great presentation, and I hope you all got a good insight as to how big data analytics and predictive analytics can really give you new insight into your workforce and hiring and managing workforce that rear view mirror traditional analytics cannot. So with that, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please just enter it in your chat screen and I'll tee them up for Mike. I think I'll go back. There's a couple questions where, Mike, people wanted some clarification on some slides. Mm-hmm. And so there was two of them. One is more clarification on the experience slide and how prior experience correlates with performance on the job and on tenure. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So, I should point out, first and foremost, that we're focused very much on hourly positions. So these are front and back line positions, essentially hospitality, call center, retail, fast casual dining. So I should point out that we're not considering positions like, CEO of a company or surgeon. But we found in a number of different cases that when we looked at, for example, in a call center, and we'd ask people, well, have you had call center experience? We found very little difference in terms of their performance on the job, regardless of whether they had said, yes, I have had this experience before, or no. And so what we've told people about our findings around job hoppers and previous work experience is that it's not as much, especially with these hourly roles, it's not as much a matter of where they've been as where they're going. So what we really want to think about more is their fit for this next role, and not necessarily that they've worked in a similar position and in a couple different roles in the past. How would they feel in this type of position? Do they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to perform?
Great, thanks. Another question that surfaced was related to the process of getting to this data. And so maybe for the audience, if you can kind of clarify, the specific question was, can you explain how you came up with the results of your findings if you didn't survey employees? So can you just give more of a framework and context for the different data sources that you're pulling in to yield these outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, at a minimum, we're pulling data from HR management systems, so that's giving us their hire and termination dates, as well as termination reason codes. Also in those data sets, we're getting things like location, job type, we're getting things like supervisor, wages, shift, overtime. All of those things that I mentioned, those typically come through either the HRMS or supplemental data sources we can pull in. We link that up with their performance data vis-a-vis performance management systems. So that's how we get performance on any given day of their employment on a variety of different KPIs, a few being customer satisfaction or transaction time, sales conversion, schedule adherence, and absenteeism. So what's nice is that when we pull all of those data together, we're then able to say, we know how long people stay on the job, and we know who their supervisor was and what shift they were working and what their overtime was and their wages, and we know when all of those things change. And so there are a variety of models that we can apply to that data in order to drill down and see what is the impact of each of those predictors that I just mentioned. In the case of supervisors, for example, we know who was assigned to what supervisor, how long they stayed, and whether they were transferred away or whether they left that supervisor. And so with that information, we can then determine how much do supervisors account for what's called the variance in tenure and survival. And so when we see big gaps between supervisors, as we've seen in a number of different clients, that's how we're able to say supervisors really matter. And again, these models put numbers to those, and so they're ultimately able to quantify what's the effect of a supervisor holding everything else constant. And again, we just move through the line and apply that same approach to every other variable in the database.
Great, thanks. And a nice segue to that response is a question that was submitted, which is, this all sounds it's all very interesting, but it sounds very complex. How do HR organizations need to staff in order to apply big data and predictive analytics to their practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're exactly right that that what we've seen here in this presentation is the product of a lot of work on the part of PhDs and econometricians and machine learning experts. But the good news is that, and to my point at the beginning about the HR dashboard being dead, there are a number of different companies that are starting to create almost like PhD in a box solutions, and they're essentially starting to democratize big data. So nowadays you don't need to have a massive data warehouse and teams of PhDs that are sifting through the data and generating this insight. There are organizations that are making this available to your typical HR practitioner, manager, and even your recruiters. And so that's the good news, is that we're now seeing this wave emerge where, in my opinion, in the next 5 years, and at 10 at the most, everyone's going to have the tools at their fingertips to be able to do an analysis like these, to generate insight, to understand and interpret that insight, and to share it with the organization. And so I think that's why right now it's a really exciting time to see that evolution, that big data evolution occurring within HR in the same way that it's really changed all those other industries I mentioned at the beginning.
Great, and tacking on to that question, I know we get a lot of responses where organizations feel like they're not ready for this because they don't have the data. Do you have any insight or knowledge or wisdom from working with loads of clients that could either assure them or give them guidance on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we'll talk to organizations that say, look, we're not a big data company, that's not what we do, and my response at least is whether you like to believe it or not, you are a big data company. Now, short of very small employers with just a handful of employees, virtually every organization I've ever seen has the data that exists somewhere in their data warehouse that would allow them to answer many of the questions I've mentioned here. So the first thing to point out is that, yeah, this data does exist. There's a high likelihood that any organization is maintaining it. So with that said, the difficult part is identifying first where it is and who owns that data, but even more tricky is figuring out how to make the different data streams talk to one another. And so that's where data sharing and integration becomes so key, because that is a serious challenge and something that organizations we've engaged with sometimes struggle with. But it's important to ensure that this is really about organizational kind of transformation. And so this is not just about data, but it's about ensuring that the different stewards of the data work with one another and talk to one another and are willing to collaborate in the interest of engaging in one of these big data initiatives. And to that point, I just want to make the point additionally that the best way to do this is to start small. So it can be very easy to get intimidated and to think about boiling the ocean once we see all the data that's being produced by different elements of the organization. What we often advise to clients and companies we engage with is start small, focus on a specific problem with hopefully some actionable solution, and drill in there before you try to do an expansive analysis of every factor that might influence employee engagement, attrition, and performance.
Perfect. I think we have time for two more questions, so I'll tee these up for you. One is also an extension, so there seems to be a lot of interest on the experience insight that you've derived. And so further drilling down on that, to that point, doesn't that go against the old adage that past performance is past experience, past performance is the best predictor of your future performance? So if you could speak to that a little bit, because we do have a lot of counterintuitive findings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, highlighting again that this is specific types of roles. But I would argue just because someone has a certain experience on their resume doesn't necessarily mean they were particularly good or even bad at it. So, if we're looking for a certain skill set or just a type of experience, again, someone's working in a call center, they're applying for a call center job, we know that they've worked for a call center before. That doesn't necessarily mean that they excelled in that role. Perhaps they left the job because it wasn't well suited for them or because they were terminated for performance. In that case, it's not really past performance predicting future performance. It's just the existence of, someone having a certain type of position. So I don't think that the two necessarily contradict one another in that, we want to consider what's the nature of that experience and how did that person do and did they get along with their coworkers and were they a strong performer? Those I think are more important than did someone have a similar experience and have they been exposed to the nature of this position, previously.
Great. Following on the counterintuitive big data insights that you've revealed a lot of in this presentation, one question came on the back of the finding for weather and performance data, and sort of spurred by the insight that sales conversions increase in hotter climates or hotter weather. So kind of a funny question, but it came in, would you recommend, cranking up the heat for a sales program? And I think what that leads to is maybe explaining to the attendees on the call, how do organizations take these counterintuitive insights and apply them into their practices? Is there a best practice around that, or how do companies usually take that?
Sure.
And make
So I should point out that the relationships here are more correlational than causal. So, for example, the fact that warmer temperatures tend to produce better sales conversion, I can't tell you whether that's because it's a function of the temperature, or maybe people in the South and the Southwest are just better at doing sales type work. So that doesn't necessarily mean cranking up the AC or the heat, but I should point out that we're actually in the process of studying ambient temperature in offices. So I think the broader point is this. It shows you that temperature, either the weather or ambient temperature in the office, does matter. And if I were an organization, that's something that I'd consider digging into a little bit and perhaps experimenting. And the nice thing about this example, being able to change the temperature in the office is something you can change very easily. And so maybe if you have the data to monitor performance, you can adjust the temperature a few degrees in any given direction and see if it affects performance. And if it does, that's ultimately something that's actionable that you can take action on, hopefully not making people uncomfortable in the office and forcing them to take off their jacket and so on and so forth. But it shows you a direction that you can potentially go to make very minor tweaks that can actually have a pretty big impact on the performance of your employees. And I always caution people that it just, when the gold standard when it comes to this sort of work is running an experiment. And so if there's an opportunity to do that, I'd say try it, see what the result is, and you may end up with something that's better than you were before.
Fantastic. That does bring us to the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining our webcast today.